One morning in January 1996, in Australia, an 18-year-old woman vanished. Over the next year, 2 more young women also vanished from the same area under eerily similar circumstances. The case remained unsolved for decades until DNA evidence identified the perpetrator. On January 27, 1996, Australia Day, 18-year-old Sarah Spiers and her friends were dropped off at Club Bayview in Claremont just after midnight by her sister. The night was meant to be a celebration filled with laughter and music, but events soon took a troubling turn. Sarah enjoyed the evening with her friends before eventually leaving the club on her own. Shortly after, around 2:06 a.m., Sarah called for a taxi from a public phone booth. She was seen waiting at the corner of Sterling Road and Sterling Highway, a familiar intersection in the area. When the taxi arrived just 3 minutes later, at 2:09 a.m., Sarah was nowhere to be found. Her sudden disappearance immediately raised concerns among those who had been with her. When Sarah failed to return home, her sister grew increasingly worried. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, she filed a missing persons report with the local authorities. The report marked the beginning of a search and investigation into Sarah's disappearance, but the uncertainty surrounding her whereabouts left her family and friends in distress. Not long after Sarah's disappearance, on June 9, 1996, 23-year-old Jane Rimmer and her friends began their night at Ocean Beach Hotel, later heading to the Continental Hotel. Initially, they considered continuing the night at Club Bayview, but ultimately decided against it due to the long queues outside. Noting the crowd, Jane's friends opted to catch a taxi home, while Jane chose to stay behind, planning to enjoy the night further. Jane's decision to remain out late became a cause for concern when she failed to return home. Her parents, Jenny and Trevor Rimmer, had regular contact with her, and her unexpected absence immediately raised alarm. Recognizing that something was wrong, they quickly alerted the police, initiating a search and investigation into her disappearance. Jane's body was found 55 days after her disappearance on August 3, 1996, by a woman picking wildflowers in bushland at Wellard, about 40 to 45 kilometers south of Perth. Jane was discovered naked, with defensive wounds, particularly on her wrist, and her throat had been slashed. A forensic pathologist noted that there was no conclusive evidence of indecent assault, although it could not be entirely ruled out. On March 15, 1997, 27-year-old Ciara Glennon was celebrating with friends at the Continental Hotel in Claremont. Around midnight, she began walking home alone along Sterling Highway and was last seen interacting with a driver in a light-colored vehicle near a bus stop at approximately 12:30 a.m. When Ciara did not return home, her parents filed a missing persons report, beginning a frantic search for their daughter and adding her to the growing list of young women who had vanished under mysterious circumstances in the area. Within 48 hours of Sarah's disappearance, the case was escalated and taken over by the Major Crime Squad. Recognizing the potential severity of the situation, the authorities moved quickly to coordinate resources and begin a thorough investigation. The initial urgency reflected the growing concern over the young woman's sudden and unexplained disappearance. After Jane went missing, the Western Australia Police responded by establishing a special task force called Macro. Its purpose was to investigate the 2 cases, which bore striking similarities. Both young women had vanished in Claremont under suspicious circumstances, prompting the authorities to consider a possible connection and intensify investigative efforts. Following Ciara's disappearance, the police publicly confirmed that they were investigating the work of a potential serial offender. The case gained further attention when the Western Australian government offered a reward of $250,000 for information, the largest ever offered in the state at that time. This announcement highlighted the seriousness of the situation and the urgent need for public assistance. Early inquiries focused on unidentified vehicles seen near 2 of the locations where the women had been last spotted, as well as a mysterious man captured on video footage. Suspicion also turned toward Perth's taxi drivers, since the women were last seen in situations where they might have used taxis. This included a driver who claimed to have transported Sarah the night before her disappearance, placing him under scrutiny as the investigation progressed. Nearly 3 weeks later, On April 3, 1997, Ciara's body was discovered by a bushwalker near Piccadilly Road, Eglinton, approximately 40 to 55 kilometers north of Claremont. She was semi-clothed, and the evidence suggested that she had tried to defend herself during the attack. The discovery marked a chilling development in the case, confirming that her disappearance had ended in tragedy. The authorities continued their search for Serra's body, leaving her family and the community in ongoing fear and uncertainty. Despite the efforts of the detectives, the case eventually went cold. In 2008, more than a decade later, a breakthrough in the Claremont case came when DNA found under Ciara's fingernails was matched to a 1995 Carricata Cemetery assault. This critical evidence provided the first tangible link to a known criminal act, guiding the authorities closer to a potential suspect. Over time, the investigators continued to analyze DNA profiles and compare them against the Western Australia DNA database. Eventually, a match emerged that connected the evidence from Ciara's case to a specific individual. On December 22, 2016, another 8 years later, Bradley Robert Edwards was arrested at his home in Kewdale in connection with the demises of both Jane and Ciara. The following day, he was formally charged, facing accusations not only for these cases, but also for multiple prior offenses. These included the 1988 break-in and assault of an 18-year-old woman, as well as the 1995 assault of a 17-year-old girl, underscoring a long history of violent behavior. As a 21-year-old in 1990, he had grabbed and tried to force a dishcloth into the mouth of a 40-year-old social worker while working as a telecom technician at Hollywood Hospital. A court-ordered psychological report at the time said that Edwards had been in distress that week after his de facto wife confessed to cheating on him. This victim, Wendy Davis, wrote a book about her story titled, "Don't Make a Fuss. It's Only the Claremont Serial Perpetrator." Her incident was not taken seriously. If taken seriously, it could have prevented the other crimes from taking place. She said, "I want people to understand there can be real consequences if women are not listened to when they speak up about violence." In October 2019, Edwards pleaded guilty to the non-slaying charges. This admission set the stage for a high-profile, judge-alone trial that lasted 7 months and involved testimony from over 200 witnesses. The proceedings were exhaustive, covering decades of evidence and numerous incidents, all of which painted a clear picture of Edwards' criminal pattern. On September 24, 2020, the trial concluded with Edwards being found guilty of ending the lives of Jane and Ciara. The judgment cited key evidence, including the DNA recovered from Ciara's fingernails, matching fibers from Edwards' Telstra work pants, and a 1996 Holden Commodore he had driven, and his confessions to the 1988 and 1995 assaults. Despite the compelling evidence, Edwards was acquitted of ending the life of Serra, as the prosecution could not prove beyond reasonable doubt that he was responsible for her disappearance, even though circumstantial evidence suggested a possible link. On December 23, 2020, Edwards was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 40 years. The judge described him as a dangerous predator who specifically targeted vulnerable young women. The police authorities continue to urge Edwards to reveal the location of Serra's remains, seeking to provide closure to her family and end decades of uncertainty surrounding her disappearance. While the families of the 3 women did not speak outside court, Commissioner Dawson said that they were satisfied that justice had been done. In September 2015, a man finished his shift and was never seen again. Years later, Facebook assisted with a breakthrough. Ricardas Puisys was born on March 9, 1980, in the town of Salut, Lithuania. Growing up in his home country, he eventually made the decision to leave in search of new opportunities abroad. His journey led him to Wisbech, a small market town in Cambridgeshire, United Kingdom, where he hoped to build a more secure life for himself. Upon arriving in the UK, Ricardas found work as a casual land worker. Most of his employment came through agencies, which placed him in different agricultural roles across the region. In 2015, He was working at the Night Layer Leak Company, based in Chatteris. The job was demanding but steady, and it offered him a way to sustain himself while living far away from his homeland. Life in Wisbech was modest for Ricardas. He lived in shared, multi-occupancy housing. Without a car, he relied on others or public transport to get around. Ricardas kept to himself much of the time. He had few friends and spoke only limited English, which made it difficult to form close connections outside of his immediate circle. Unlike many, he had no family nearby, and this sense of isolation meant his ties to the local Lithuanian community became especially important. It was there that he found some familiarity and comfort in a foreign land. Concerns about Ricardas's well-being began to surface when he failed to turn up for a scheduled shift just 2 days after he was last seen. Colleagues quickly grew worried, as Ricardas had always been reliable with his work. The sense of unease deepened when his identification badge was discarded in a local park, raising questions about what might have happened to him. The last confirmed sighting of Ricardas was on September 26, 2015, at the Night Layer Leak Company in Chatteris, the very place where he had been employed. That evening, he appeared to vanish without explanation. Shortly after, a local resident went to the police to report the troubling situation, setting in motion a chain of events that would soon escalate into something far more serious. By November 2015, the Cambridgeshire police launched a full-scale investigation. The decision came after the detectives developed the belief that Ricardas might have been a victim of modern slavery. What troubled the investigators most was that no body had been found, yet the circumstances strongly suggested that Ricardas had come to harm. Witnesses began coming forward, claiming that Ricardas was seen in the company of a small group of Lithuanian men on the night he disappeared. These accounts painted a concerning picture of his final hours, suggesting that he had not simply walked away from his life, but had instead been taken into a dangerous situation. The detectives treated these statements seriously as they pieced together the fragments of Ricardas's last known movements. The investigation quickly grew in scale, with the officers following up on numerous leads. Teams worked tirelessly, interviewing potential witnesses, retracing Ricardas's steps, and searching for any clue that might explain his disappearance. In December 2015, a man in his 30s was arrested in connection with the case. The development briefly raised hopes that the investigation might be nearing a breakthrough. However, after questioning, the suspect was released without further action, leaving the police once again at a standstill, and the case went cold. In late 2019, 4 years later, the case of Ricardas took an unexpected turn when the police discovered a Facebook account operating under his name. The page contained photographs that appeared to be of him, raising the possibility that he might still be alive. Despite this promising lead, the investigators were unable to confirm the authenticity of the images or establish whether Ricardas was actively behind the account. As word of the Facebook activity spread, reports began to surface of potential sightings of Ricardas in both Wisbech and nearby King's Lynn. Each account was treated with caution, as previous leads had often led to ends. Still, the prospect that he might be alive reignited hope among those who had long believed his disappearance concealed more than met the eye. Remarkably, nearly 5 years after he had last been seen, Ricardas was finally found alive on July 1st, 2020. The police discovered him hiding in dense undergrowth in a woodland area near Wisbech, less than 2 miles from where he had lived. The revelation stunned both the investigators and the community. Ricardas had been living in a makeshift camp, deliberately hidden from view and avoiding human contact. His survival depended on staying unnoticed, and he succeeded in remaining undetected for years. The choice to live this way appeared to be tied to his past experiences, as the police later confirmed that he had previously been a victim of crime and was intentionally concealing himself. The hidden camp was located in deep undergrowth off a residential street, yet it remained out of sight from passers-by. The authorities described the site as very well concealed, so much so that it could easily have been overlooked during the years of searching. The ingenuity of its construction explained how Ricardas managed to stay out of reach for so long, even while living so close to the town where he had disappeared. After locating Ricardas in the woodland, the police immediately brought him into the station. This was done not only to verify his well-being, but also to provide him with a safe environment after years of isolation. The officers recognized the vulnerability of his situation and ensured he was placed under protection while further steps were taken. In the days that followed, the authorities arranged for Ricardas to move into a safe house in another part of the country. This relocation was crucial, as the investigators launched a modern slavery case connected to his ordeal. By removing him from the area, they aimed to shield him from further harm and allow him to rebuild his life without fear of reprisal. The detective chief inspector handling the case revealed that Ricardas had been forced into a form of modern slavery by an individual with links to organized crime. This connection shed new light on why his disappearance had seemed so troubling from the beginning. It became clear that Ricardas had been exploited and controlled in ways that prevented him from living freely. After he was found, Ricardas began to share parts of his story. He described being violently assaulted on 2 occasions after his arrival in the UK for work. One attack involved a set of keys being used as a weapon, while another saw him beaten with a barbecue. These violent acts left him living in constant fear, shaping the decision he would later make to retreat from society altogether. The abuse did not stop at physical violence. Ricardas explained how the man controlling him had taken his passport and bank card, effectively stripping him of his independence. Even his wages at the farm where he worked were siphoned away, leaving him trapped in a cycle of exploitation with no obvious way out. According to the DCI, Ricardas's decision to live in hiding was driven by these experiences. Fearing for his life, he kept himself a prisoner in the woods for nearly 5 years, believing it was the only way to stay safe. His remarkable survival was not just an act of endurance, but also a reflection of the extreme lengths he felt he had to go to in order to escape the grip of his abuser. In October 1980, the body of a 29-year-old man was discovered in Yavapai County, Arizona. Nearly 40 years later, DNA testing on cigarette butts identified the perpetrators. Michael E. Lee was born in 1951. By the age of 29, he had established himself as an iron worker. Though he lived in Indiana, Michael often traveled to Arizona. On October 21, 1980, the body of Michael was discovered off Highway 179 near milepost 300. The location, an unincorporated area of Yavapai County just outside Prescott, became the grim backdrop of his final moments. The quiet stretch of road, often used by travelers passing through Arizona, now carried the weight of a shocking crime. The discovery marked the abrupt end of Michael's life at just 29 years old. The police authorities were immediately dispatched to the scene. Upon arrival, they secured the area and quickly confirmed that Michael was deceased. The circumstances of his demise pointed to violence rather than accident, and the investigators were forced to confront the reality that a crime had taken place. The presence of law enforcement and the investigators transformed the desolate roadside into an active crime scene. An autopsy was conducted to determine the cause of demise. The medical examination revealed that Michael had suffered multiple gunshot wounds to the head, leaving no doubt that his life had been ended. The brutality of the act raised questions about who could have targeted him and why. For the investigators, the findings solidified the direction of the case. They were now searching for a perpetrator. Following these revelations, the police began their investigation. They combed through what evidence was available, hoping to reconstruct the final hours of his life. The investigators sought to uncover where Michael had been, who he may have encountered, and what circumstances led to his violent end. Each question pointed to an urgent need for answers. Despite these efforts, the investigation soon faced challenges. Information was scarce and leads proved difficult to develop. Witnesses were few, and the isolated location provided little in the way of immediate clues. As time passed, the case grew colder. Without new leads or breakthroughs, Michael's case slipped into the growing list of unresolved crimes. In June 2018, nearly 4 decades after the case was opened, a new development brought fresh attention to the case. A volunteer working with the sheriff's cold case unit submitted cigarette butts collected from the original crime scene for DNA testing. The decision marked a turning point, as modern forensic methods offered possibilities that had not existed in 1980. When the results came back, they revealed a critical lead. The DNA extracted from the cigarettes matched that of David Ellsworth Widmer. At the time of the crime, Widmer had been 31 years old. This discovery connected him directly to the scene and reignited the investigation. In the months that followed, the detectives began piecing together more information about Widmer and his possible connection to Michael. Their investigation revealed that Widmer had not acted alone. Along with an accomplice named Rocky Crabtree, Widmer had targeted Michael with the intent to rob him. This detail reshaped the understanding of the crime, showing that Michael's demise had been the result of a violent plan carried out by two convicted felons. The detectives came to believe that both Widmer and Crabtree bore responsibility. The evidence suggested that the robbery attempt escalated into a fatal attack, leaving Michael with multiple gunshot wounds to the head. The men's criminal pasts aligned with the violent nature of the crime, reinforcing the investigators' conclusion that the pair were behind the crime. By the time these connections were established, however, both suspects were no longer alive. Crabtree had passed away in 1990, and Widmer passed away in 2019. Their demises closed the door on the possibility of prosecution, leaving justice unattainable in the legal sense. For the investigators, this reality was frustrating, as it meant the answers came too late to hold anyone accountable in court. Still, the investigation pressed forward. Even without the chance to see the suspects face trial, law enforcement remained committed to completing the case. As the investigation developed further, the detectives established that Michael personally knew both Crabtree and Widmer. The connection among the three men helped explain how Crabtree and Widmer were able to approach Michael without raising suspicion before carrying out their plan. In July 2020, the motive, the investigators concluded, was robbery. Information had reached Crabtree and Widmer suggesting that Michael carried a significant amount of cash with him. According to what they were told, he supposedly kept the money tied in a bandana around his leg. This detail became central to the fatal decision made by the two suspects, who sought to profit from what they believed would be an easy target. When Michael was found, the investigators noted that the bandana had been cut from his leg. Forensic analysis later confirmed that Widmer's DNA was present on the fabric, further cementing his link to the crime. Yet their plan revealed a fatal miscalculation. Despite their violent actions, Crabtree and Widmer failed to search Michael's wallet. His wallet, which remained in the pocket of his pants, contained more than $1,000 in cash. The oversight underscored the flawed nature of their crime, revealing that the robbery not only cost Michael his life, but also ended with the suspects missing the very money they had intended to steal. What they did appear to take, however, was a small amount of marijuana that Michael had in his possession. Based on interviews conducted during the investigation, the detectives noted that the marijuana was described as ditch or skunk weed, a low-quality substance of little real value. In the end, the perpetrators had taken nothing of significance, leaving behind both the cash and any meaningful gain from their crime. With the findings in hand, the investigators reached out to Michael's family to share the conclusions of the case. While Crabtree and Widmer had long since passed away and could not be prosecuted, the detectives were firm in their belief that both men would have been charged with taking the life of Michael if they were still alive. The case, though unresolved in court, was brought to a form of closure. For Michael's family, the answers offered a measure of peace, even as the detectives acknowledged that true justice, in the legal sense, would never come. In April 1994, a mother and daughter disappeared from Charleston, South Carolina. Nearly 20 years later, the truth surfaced on Australia's Sunshine Coast. Savanna Todd was born on May 6, 1993, the daughter of Dorothy Lee Barnett and Benjamin Harris Todd III. Harris was a financial advisor, while Dorothy worked as a flight attendant. At first, their lives appeared typical of a young couple starting a family. But trouble had already been brewing behind closed doors. Dorothy and Harris got married in December 1991, but the relationship soon began to unravel. Arguments and tension overshadowed the marriage, and the bond that had once brought them together steadily weakened. What started as marital struggles eventually grew into disputes that neither could reconcile, setting the stage for a painful separation. As the marriage fell apart, issues of mental health began to surface. Dorothy faced difficulties that were brought into question during the legal proceedings. These concerns became a central part of the divorce process, and they directly influenced the direction of the custody battle that followed. The private disagreements of the couple soon became matters of public record inside a courtroom. After Savanna's birth in May 1993, custody became the primary issue between her parents. Both Dorothy and Harris wanted to raise their daughter, but the courts were tasked with deciding where the child would live. Testimonies, evidence, and concerns shaped the decision, making the custody hearings highly contentious and emotionally charged for everyone involved. Ultimately, the court ruled in favor of Harris, awarding him full custody of Savanna. Dorothy was not completely cut out of her daughter's life, however. She was granted visitation rights every other weekend, a decision meant to maintain Savanna's connection with her mother while securing stability under her father's care. On April 24, 1994, when Savanna was about 11 months old, Dorothy picked her up for a scheduled visitation. What should have been a routine exchange between parents turned into the beginning of a long nightmare. Instead of returning her daughter at the agreed time, Dorothy disappeared with Savanna, leaving Harris waiting in vain. The scheduled visitation ended with silence and absence, not with the child being brought home. When she failed to bring Savanna back, Harris immediately contacted the authorities. His worst fears had been realized. His daughter was gone, and so was her mother. Soon after, Savanna was officially listed as a missing child and identified as a victim of parental abduction. At first, the Charleston County Police treated the matter as a custody violation. Parental disputes were not unusual, and law enforcement initially approached the situation within the framework of family court issues. But as hours turned into days, it became clear that this was more than a local custody problem. Dorothy and Savanna could not be located, and the nature of the disappearance raised the level of concern dramatically. The possibility of false identities came under serious consideration, especially given Dorothy's previous work as a flight attendant. Her background in aviation, coupled with her ability to travel, left the authorities fearing that she could bypass normal restrictions and possibly even leave the country with forged documents. Within days of the abduction, the investigation was escalated and handed over to the FBI. The case now involved interstate flight, and the potential for international travel made it even more urgent. In the months that followed, the investigators chased down tips suggesting that Dorothy had gone to Texas, Florida, or even Belize, where her mother lived. Dorothy and Savanna remained missing, and with no confirmed sightings, the trail slowly grew cold. After nearly 2 decades of unanswered questions, the search for Savanna finally came to an end in September 2013. The authorities located Dorothy and her daughter on Australia's Sunshine Coast, where they had been living quietly for years. Dorothy had remarried in 1995, just a year after she fled with Savanna. Under her new life, she created fictitious names for both her and her daughter, ensuring that their real identities remained hidden from anyone who might search for them. When confronted, Dorothy claimed that her actions had been driven by fear. She alleged that Harris had been abusive, insisting this was her reason for abducting Savanna. However, the doctors who had examined the situation during the original custody battle found no evidence to support her claims. The courts had already dismissed those allegations, making her justification a matter of dispute rather than fact. After her arrest in Australia, Dorothy was extradited back to the United States to face charges. In court, she pled guilty to kidnapping, ending the decades-long case. The sentence handed down was 21 months in prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. Though the punishment was far less than the time she had spent in hiding, it officially closed the criminal chapter of the case. Dorothy served her prison term, and upon release, continued on supervised release until 2017. During that time, her daughter, now known as Samantha Geldenhuys, stood by her side. Savanna had grown up under a different name and life story, but once the truth emerged, she chose to support the mother who had raised her, even as the legal consequences played out. In 2014, Savanna was reunited with her maternal relatives, reconnecting with the family she had been separated from for so long. A year later, in 2015, she was finally reunited with her father. Despite the difficult history, Savanna expressed a hope to maintain a relationship with both her father and her mother, choosing to look toward the future rather than remain in the past. In June 1980, a 14-year-old girl disappeared in Antioch, California. Decades later, the case was solved using modern DNA testing and FBI systems that had not existed at the time the case was opened. Suzanne Arlene Susie Bombardier was born on March 14, 1966. She grew up in Antioch, California, a community located in Contra Costa County. In 1980, 14-year-old Suzanne was attending Antioch Junior High School. She was an honor roll student, recognized for her dedication to her studies and her ability to excel academically. Suzanne also took an active role in school activities. She was a member of the California Junior Scholastic Federation, a program that recognized students for academic achievement and involvement. Looking ahead, Suzanne had big dreams. Among them was her aspiration to try out for the cheerleading team. On June 22, 1980, Suzanne was spending the evening babysitting her two young nieces at her sister's home in Antioch. It was the very first night of summer vacation, a time when most teenagers looked forward to carefree days ahead. For Suzanne, the night began like any other, with the simple responsibility of caring for her sister's children. When her sister returned home the next morning, everything seemed strangely out of place. Her two little girls were safe inside the house, unharmed and untouched, but Suzanne was nowhere to be found. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no broken locks or shattered windows to suggest an intruder had broken in. This unsettling discovery made her sister realize almost immediately that something was terribly wrong. Panic set in quickly. Suzanne's sister reported her missing to the Antioch Police Department, and the investigators began trying to piece together what might have happened. At just 14 years old, Suzanne's sudden disappearance was alarming to both her family and the wider community. What began as a missing person case would soon turn into something far more tragic. 5 days later, on June 27th, the search came to a devastating end. Suzanne's body was discovered floating in the San Joaquin River near the Antioch Bridge. The discovery shattered any remaining hope that she might still be alive. For her loved ones, the nightmare had only deepened. An autopsy revealed the grim details of her demise. Suzanne had been indecently assaulted and stabbed once in the chest. The fatal wound pierced her heart, a single act of violence that ended her young life. The brutality of the crime left the investigators certain that her perpetrator had acted with both cruelty and intent. The police suspected early on that the perpetrator was likely someone who knew the family. Despite interviewing people close to Suzanne and pursuing various leads, the technology available in 1980 limited what the investigators could prove. With no arrest made and evidence difficult to process, the case grew cold, leaving unanswered questions and a grieving family without justice. In 2015, 35 years later, new hope emerged in Suzanne's case. The investigators reopened the long cold file after a friend of Suzanne, along with her niece, met with two retired detectives who had originally worked on the investigation back in 1980. Their determination to find answers reignited interest in the case, and with advances in forensic science, the possibility of uncovering the truth was finally within reach. As part of the renewed investigation, the police turned to modern technology. They used an FBI indexing system that had not been available at the time of the crime to examine DNA evidence preserved from the scene. This approach allowed the investigators to analyze biological material in a way that was impossible in 1980, providing a new pathway toward identifying a suspect. In 2017, their efforts paid off. A CODIS match identified Mitchell Lynn Bacom, a convicted offender who was already known to the Bombardier family, as the suspect in the case. On December 11, 2017, the authorities arrested Bacom, who was then 63 years old. The arrest was made without incident, marking a major breakthrough after nearly 4 decades of unanswered questions. The case then moved through the courts. On March 15, 2022, a Contra Costa County jury found Bacom guilty of first-degree slaying. The conviction carried special circumstances, including burglary, kidnapping, and assault, all tied to the horrific crime against Suzanne. After years of waiting, the legal system had finally delivered a verdict. On June 27th, exactly 42 years after Suzanne's body was found, Bacom was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, the prosecutors revealed disturbing information. Bacom had allegedly confessed to a former cellmate about committing similar crimes against other victims during his time as a truck driver. This revelation painted a chilling picture of a man capable of repeated violence. For the Bombardier family, justice had finally been served, but it came at a painful cost. A detective involved in the case reflected on the outcome, acknowledging that justice did not come swiftly for Suzanne's loved ones. Decades of waiting, grief, and uncertainty had weighed heavily on them, and while the conviction provided closure, it also underscored the long and difficult path to accountability. In October 1993, following the demise of a Harlem, New York drag queen, friends cleaning out her apartment stumbled upon a disturbing discovery. Following Dorian Corey's demise, those sorting through her belongings came across a large trunk that had been stored away for years. Inside, to their horror, was a mummified body. The condition of the remains immediately posed challenges for the investigators, as the body had been concealed for an extensive period of time. The body was badly preserved, complicating efforts to determine even the most basic facts, such as identity or cause of demise. The natural process of mummification had left little usable tissue. There were no immediate leads, no identification documents, and dental records could not be matched. At first, it seemed the mystery of the trunk might remain unsolved. The police had to turn to unusual forensic methods in order to move the investigation forward. One of the most striking techniques involved extracting fingerprints from the mummified hands. Chemically treating the stiff, dried fingers allowed the investigators to soften the tissue enough to press workable prints. This breakthrough provided the first real opportunity to connect the remains to a known individual. The investigators also examined the items sealed within the trunk for clues about the time frame. Among the contents were flip tabs from beer cans, a design no longer in use by the 1980s. By establishing that these tabs dated back to the 1960s and 1970s, the police were able to approximate how long the trunk and its grim contents had been hidden. Every small detail offered a new piece of the puzzle. Eventually, after painstaking work, the body was identified as Robert Bobby Worley. This identification connected the remains to a man who had once lived in New York decades earlier. The revelation brought clarity to a mystery that had lingered since the trunk was first opened, but it also raised deeper questions about how Bobby had ended up in such a state and why his body had remained undiscovered for so long. At some point, Bobby made his way to New York, though the exact timing of this move remains uncertain. His brother had already relocated there in 1956, and Bobby followed later, though the gap in years makes it unclear when and why he decided to make the transition. This move would mark the beginning of the life he built in the city, one that would later intertwine with both crime and attempts at stability. In 1963, Bobby's life took a dark turn when he was arrested for assault. The arrest led to his incarceration at Sing Sing Prison, a place known for housing some of the state's most serious offenders. His time behind bars would last until 1966, when he was granted release. After leaving prison, Bobby appeared to take steps toward building a new life. he secured work as a building superintendent for an apartment building on Edgecombe Avenue in Harlem. At some stage following his release, Bobby went to stay with his brother in the Bronx. It was during this period that he began using the name Bobby Wells. Whether this name change was meant to provide a fresh start or to distance himself from his criminal past is not definitively known, but it marked a shift in how he presented himself to those around him. The identity of Bobby Wells became his new face to the world. The investigation in 1993 revealed that he was fatally shot to the head. This fact transformed the discovery from a bizarre case of concealment into a matter of a violent end. Though the body had been hidden away for years, the gunshot made it clear that Bobby's end had not been accidental. The police eventually learned that he had last been seen by his family in 1968. This significant gap between his disappearance and the discovery of his body in 1993 reinforced the likelihood that he had been hidden in the trunk for decades. For the investigators, the timeline was consistent with the beer can flip tabs and other dated evidence found alongside the remains. Speculation began to circulate about what might have happened inside Dorian's apartment all those years ago. One prevailing theory suggested that she may have shot Bobby in self-defense during a violent altercation or attempted robbery. Given the discovery of a gunshot wound to his head, this scenario seemed plausible. If true, it could explain both his demise and the decision to conceal his body rather than report the incident to the authorities. Accounts from friends and acquaintances added further weight to the speculation. Several described Dorian and Bobby as having had a turbulent and often volatile relationship. Alcohol was said to play a role, with heavy drinking at times intensifying conflicts between the two. These recollections, while not conclusive, painted a picture of a relationship marked by instability and potential danger. Despite these reports, no criminal charges were ever filed against Dorian. The lack of direct evidence, combined with Dorian's own passing before the body was discovered, left the investigators without the ability to pursue the case further, and is thus closed. In November 1993, Bobby's body was buried in Hart Island, New York. Hart Island has long served as a potter's field, the burial ground for unclaimed or unidentified individuals. With no family members coming forward to claim his remains, he was interred there, marking the final chapter of his life in a place known for anonymity and forgotten histories. In October 1955, 3 boys from Chicago, Illinois never returned home. For nearly 4 decades, the cases went unsolved, haunting the city and devastating the families left behind. John Schuessler was born on November 30th, 1941. 2 years later, he became the older brother of Anton Schuessler Jr. Together, the 2 siblings shared a strong bond, often spending their free time enjoying activities typical of boys their age. One pastime they especially loved was bowling, a sport their father frequently encouraged by taking them to local alleys. At 13 years old, John's life had already been marked by hardship. He had previously endured serious injuries in an automobile accident. The aftermath of this trauma brought noticeable changes to his personality. Before, he had been independent, but after the accident, his mother observed that John seemed to be easily influenced and often dominated by other boys his age. This shift would shape how he interacted with peers and friends as he grew older. Anton, at 11, looked up to his older brother, and their closeness was reflected in the time they spent together. John also developed a friendship with Robert Peterson, a boy who was 14 years old. Robert, like John, enjoyed sports and quickly became a central figure in the brothers' circle of friends. Robert came from a family where sports were encouraged. His father, a carpenter and Little League coach, played a significant role in fostering his interest. Twice a week during the fall, Robert's father would take him bowling, strengthening both their bond and Robert's growing love for the game. This shared interest tied Robert closely to the Schuessler brothers, as bowling became a thread weaving their friendships together. It was a Sunday in October of 1955 when Robert, John, and Anton set out for what seemed like a simple afternoon trip. The boys had planned to see a matinee downtown, a movie that Robert's mother had helped them select. She suggested the Disney documentary, The African Lion, and sent them on their way, unaware that this would be the last time she saw her son. When the boys failed to return home, the atmosphere of calm gave way to alarm. Hours passed, and both sets of parents began to grow deeply concerned. It did not take long before the families contacted the police, reporting that their sons had not come back from the theater. The situation felt all the more urgent because the trip had been so ordinary, just an afternoon movie downtown. Worry quickly escalated into fear as the parents realized something was terribly wrong. Both fathers immediately took to the streets in search of their missing children. They first went to the theater where the boys were supposed to be, but the search yielded nothing. They extended their efforts to other nearby theaters, hoping the boys might have changed their plans. The fathers also visited a bowling alley, given Robert's well-known fondness for the game. Robert, often called Bobby, had spent many afternoons bowling, and it seemed like a logical place to check. Later, it would be confirmed that the boys had indeed stopped into at least one bowling alley during that day. But despite this clue, the father's desperate search ended without results. 2 days later, on October 18th, the search reached a devastating conclusion. The bodies of the 3 boys were discovered in a ditch within Robinson Woods Forest Preserve, located on Chicago's northwest side. The discovery shattered any remaining hope that the children might return safely. Instead of finding them alive, the families were faced with a grim and incomprehensible reality. The details of the crime scene revealed a chilling picture of violence. When found, the boys were naked, bound, gagged, and strangled. Each demise bore signs of a different method of strangulation. Anton, the youngest, had been manually strangled. His older brother John's life appeared to have been taken using a chokehold. Robert, the eldest of the group, had likely been strangled with a belt or rope. The case of the Chicago boys remained unresolved for nearly 4 decades. Despite the brutality of the crime and the intense public outcry it generated, the investigators were unable to bring the perpetrator to justice in the years immediately following the discovery. The reopening of the case came during a separate probe into the 1977 disappearance of candy heiress Helen Voorhees Brack. This disappearance was tied to a larger scandal involving horses' lives that were ended and insurance fraud that swept through the Chicago horse world. While the investigators pursued leads connected to that scandal, attention shifted unexpectedly back to the unsolved cases of 1955. The renewed focus on the case eventually pointed toward a man with ties to the horse industry. That man was Kenneth Hansen, a former stable hand and employee of the Idle Hour stable. Hansen emerged as the primary suspect after evidence and testimony linked him. In July of 1995, he was arrested. The prosecution's case against Hansen relied heavily on witness testimony. Multiple individuals came forward, claiming that Hansen had confessed to the crimes at various points in time. These alleged confessions included specific details, such as Hansen picking up the boys while they were hitchhiking near Milwaukee Avenue and Lawrence Avenue, taking them to Idle Hour's stable, and attempting to molest them. According to testimony, Hansen admitted that when one of the boys threatened to report him, he ended their lives to silence the threat. Among the testimonies, certain details stood out. One witness stated that Hansen specifically mentioned Robert by name when recounting the events. Another witness testified that Hansen confessed as early as October 1955, only days after the bodies were discovered, saying that he had just slain the 3 boys. These accounts became the foundation of the state's case against him, offering jurors a narrative that directly linked Hansen to the crime. In 1995, Hansen was convicted in a jury trial and sentenced to a term of 200 to 300 years in prison. His conviction was later overturned on appeal due to the improper admission of certain evidence, but the pursuit of justice did not end there. Hansen was retried in 2002, and once again, the jury found him guilty. He remained incarcerated until he passed away on September 13, 2007 at Pontiac Correctional Center. With his passing, the case was effectively closed, bringing an end to one of Chicago's most haunting true crime stories. In 1985, a mother and two of her daughters were brutally slain in their home. It would take over 20 years and 3 trials before their perpetrator would be brought to justice. In the spring of 1985, Fayetteville, North Carolina, was a place where families left their doors unlocked, children played freely in front yards, and neighbors watched out for one another. It was also home to Captain Gary Eastburn, his wife Katie, and their 3 little girls, 5-year-old Ciara, 3-year-old Erin, and 22-month-old Jana. On May 7, 1985, Gary kissed his family goodbye and boarded a plane for England. He was heading overseas for a temporary training assignment with the Air Force, leaving Katie to care for the children. It was not unusual for him to be gone, but this time, fate had something unspeakable waiting. Since the Eastburn family was planning to relocate to England so that Gary could take up a liaison job with the Royal Air Force, Katie made arrangements to rehouse the family's dog, Dixie. She had placed an ad in the paper to find a new home for Dixie. Within days, a man named Timothy Hennis, a 27-year-old Army sergeant from nearby Fort Bragg, showed up at her door to take the dog. Their interaction was brief, ordinary, at least on the surface. Neither Katie nor her daughters could have known this was the beginning of their end. By May 10th, the newspapers began to pile up at the end of the Eastburn driveway. A neighbor, Catherine Strickland, began to feel a knot in her stomach. Something was wrong. The following day, on May 11th, silence filled the Eastburn home. No one had seen Katie, and the girls were not playing outside. The blinds were drawn. Katie also did not respond to her husband Gary's routine phone call. That next day, the neighbors could no longer ignore the signs. They called the police to request a welfare check. When the officers stepped into the Eastburn home, the stench was immediate. Upstairs, they found Katie in her bedroom, unclothed from the waist down, brutally, indecently assaulted and stabbed 15 times. Just down the hall, 5-year-old Ciara was found stabbed repeatedly in the chest, and 3-year-old Erin had been bludgeoned in the chest and back, each fatally stabbed repeatedly as they slept, and their throats slashed. Incredibly, 22-month-old Jana was still alive in her crib, weak but clinging to life after being left for days without food or water. She had survived what her mother and sisters could not. The sight shocked even hardened investigators. This was not just a slaying, it was a massacre. While combing the house, the investigators found fingerprints and hair. A luminol test of the walls and master bathroom indicated that somebody had tried unsuccessfully to clean up the crime scene. After returning to Fayetteville, Gary helped the detectives identify missing items, including an envelope of cash, Katie's ATM card, and a piece of paper containing her ATM password. The investigators believed that the crime happened between 8 p.m. on May 9th and 3 a.m. on May 10th. The detectives, desperate to find the perpetrator, even turned to baby Jana, the only survivor, to see if there were clues she could offer. They brought in child psychologist Helen Brantley to question Jana and show her pictures of her family and police photo lineups. According to her summary report, she was not certain that Jana had seen what happened that night, but had clearly heard things. Still, it was nothing that could conclusively help the investigation. Although baby Jana could not help, in the days after the crime, the police found someone who could. A young man came forward and said that he saw a white male leaving the Eastburns' home near Fort Bragg at 3:30 that morning. A tall white man dressed in jeans, a knit cap, and a black members-only jacket exiting the Eastburns' driveway, carrying a garbage bag in the early morning hours of May 10th. The man drove away in a white Chevrolet Chevette. The investigators also found a bloody sneaker print at the scene. The witness helped the police to create a composite sketch of the suspect. The detectives soon learned of the dog adoption and focused on Timothy Hennis. On May 15th, just 3 days after the bodies were discovered, Hennis was arrested and charged with indecent assault and 3 counts of slaying. In 1986, a jury convicted Hennis and he was sentenced to the end-of-life penalty. But the case would not end there. In 1988, the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned the conviction, ruling that the jury had been unfairly swayed by graphic crime scene photographs. At his second trial in 1989, Hennis was acquitted. He walked free, returned to the army, and went on to serve honorably, even retiring as a master sergeant in 2004. For years, it seemed that the Eastburn case might never find justice. By the early 2000s, forensic science had advanced. In 2006, the investigators retested male DNA evidence preserved from the crime scene. The results were chilling. The DNA belonged to Timothy Hennis. Though the Fifth Amendment's double jeopardy clause prohibits retrials after acquittals, the United States Constitution's dual sovereignty doctrine allows a defendant tried and acquitted in a state court to be retried at a federal court. In addition, the Uniform Code of Military Justice permits military personnel tried in a civilian court to be court-martialed. At the request of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, Lieutenant General John R. Vines, the commanding officer at Fort Bragg, agreed to recall the retired Hennis back into service as a pretext for charging him with the Eastburn case based on the new DNA evidence. On September 26, 2006, Hennis was recalled to military duty and returned to Fort Bragg the following month, quitting his job at the waste treatment plant in the process. In August 2007, the commander of the 18th Airborne Corps ordered that Hennis be court-martialed on 3 counts of premeditated slaying. In December, Hennis appealed this decision because the Army lacked jurisdiction, but this petition was denied in April 2008. In May, Hennis appealed against the court-martial decision at the United States Army Court of Criminal Appeals, but it was dismissed the following month. In September, Hennis appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, but this was dismissed. In December 2009, Hennis appealed against the court-martial at the United States District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina, but this was also rejected in March 2010. Hennis's court-martial at Fort Bragg began on March 17, 2010, and lasted for 3 weeks. For the court-martial, Hennis enlisted the services of military lawyer Frank Spinner and 2 uniformed lawyers. The prosecution was represented by Army Captains Matt Scott and Nathan Huff. Colonel Patrick Parrish presided over the court-martial proceedings, while a jury panel of 14 military officers and non-commissioned personnel was convened. During the trial, the prosecution focused on the DNA evidence, with the prior eyewitness accounts as corroborating evidence. Spinner's defense team argued that the footprints, blood, and hair samples found at the crime scene did not match Hennis or the victims. In addition, they suggested that the crime scene evidence at the former Eastburn family home in Fayetteville had been contaminated. In response to the DNA evidence, Spinner suggested that Hennis had consensual intercourse with Katie before her end. Hennis himself denied having ever had intercourse with Katie, consensually or otherwise. Following 3 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Hennis guilty on April 3, 2010. The jury convicted him once again, and on April 8, 2010, he was sentenced again to the end-of-life penalty. Hennis remains on the capital punishment row at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Baby Jana, the only survivor, grew up with the knowledge that she was spared while her mother and sisters were taken in the most brutal way imaginable. A missing Indiana man's case was finally solved after 2 decades. The truth finally came out not because of a confession, but because of a curious family member, a genealogy website, and a long-buried secret that could no longer hide. On February 10, 1993, in Indianapolis, Indiana, Richard Hoagland picked up the phone and called his wife, Linda. His words were hurried and vague. "I am not feeling well. I am going to the emergency room." Linda offered to go with him, but he said he did not have time to wait for her to go with him. Linda waited for hours. Richard never came home. When she called the local hospitals, none had a record of him checking in. His car was not found, and there was no note. His toothbrush was still there. He did not pack any clothes. It was cold. It was in February. He did not take a coat. He did not even take his passport. Their son Matthew was 9 years old at the time, and his brother Doug was just 6 years old. Just like that, Richard, a husband and father of 2 boys, was gone. Linda said, "He was very spontaneous. He was a shaker and a roller. He was always making deals and doing things. He was very successful. He was a lot of fun to be with. The family had a big house, a steady income, and exotic vacations. The police were brought in. At first, foul play was suspected, but when the investigators dug deeper, they discovered something far stranger. Richard did not just vanish. He had emptied joint bank accounts, taken important documents, and even left behind clues suggesting this was no random disappearance. He left Linda struggling to pay bills and to raise their children alone. The authorities eventually found Richard's car abandoned at Indianapolis International Airport, but there was no record of him taking any flights out of the airport the day he went missing. That summer, his two sons both received a birthday card from their father, each containing $50. Doug's card said, "Maybe sometime soon we will get to see each other. I bet I will not even know you. It has been so long. Mind your mother. Bye, Dad." Those words were the last they ever heard from him. Linda lost the house and cars after he vanished. Her mother stepped in to help. As the months turned into years, the truth became clearer. Richard was not taken. He chose to disappear. After 10 years, Richard was declared deceased. Linda eventually moved on and remarried. What no one in Indiana knew was that Richard had headed to Florida, where he pulled off something few could imagine. He stole another man's identity. The identity belonged to a fisherman named Terry Szymanski, who had passed away in 1991 at the age of 33. By digging through public records, Richard found Terry's birth certificate and used it to rebuild his life. As Terry, Richard married again. He had a child. He bought property, held jobs, and lived as if nothing had ever happened in Indiana. For more than 2 decades, he lived a second life, hidden in plain sight. The deception finally began to crumble in 2016, when Terry's real nephew started building a family tree online. While researching, he stumbled across something bizarre. Records showing that Terry Szymanski had remarried years after he had passed away. Alarmed, the nephew contacted the authorities and an investigation was launched. The investigation revealed the truth. The man living in Florida as Terry Szymanski was, in fact, Richard Hoagland, missing since 1993. Richard was arrested, charged with identity theft, and faced the family he had abandoned decades earlier. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. For Linda and her sons, the news brought a mix of emotions: relief, anger, sadness, all blended together. For years they had lived with questions, wondering what had happened to their loved one. The answers were devastating. He had walked away, rebuilt his life, and started a new family while leaving his first family behind. On May 14, 2018, a judge ordered Richard to pay $1.86 million in back child support. A 1996 Virginia cold case has been solved a decade after the crime took place. In May 1996, the police in Virginia Beach responded to a horrifying scene inside a quiet home. Elise Makdessi, a 27-year-old Navy air traffic controller, was found tied to her bed, her throat cut, and she was stabbed multiple times. Lying nearby was Quincy Brown, another Navy sailor that was fatally shot. At first, the detectives struggled to make sense of it. But as they dug deeper, they uncovered a tangled story of lies, money, and betrayal. Just days before her end, Elise made a videotape accusing fellow sailors, including Quincy Brown, of harassing and indecently assaulting her. Sitting beside her was her husband, Eddie Makdessi, who appeared to be supporting her. But the investigators later came to believe that the tape was part of a bigger plan. The prosecutors argued that Eddie and Elise staged the video to strengthen a lawsuit against the Navy and to collect life insurance money. On the night of May 14, 1996, Quincy was invited to the Makdessi home. What he did not know was that he was walking into a trap. According to the prosecutors, Eddie fatally shot Quincy as soon as he arrived. Then, to tie up loose ends, he turned on Elise, ending her life in a brutal attack. Eddie claimed that it was self-defense, saying Quincy had attacked Elise and he intervened. But the blood evidence and the way Elise was bound proved otherwise. After the crime, Eddie fled the U.S. Despite the best efforts of the detectives, they could not find him and the case went cold. A decade later, he resurfaced in Russia, trying to start over. He was then caught and extradited back to Virginia to face trial. In 2006, Eddie stood before a jury. The prosecutors laid out their case. Eddie had plotted the attacks for financial gain, using Elise's false accusations as a setup. The jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree slaying. Eddie was sentenced to life in prison and ordered to pay over $200,000 in fines. The case leaves people wondering, was Elise a willing partner in Eddie's scheme, or was she manipulated by him? Did she know Quincy would be slain that night? Or was she expecting something very different? What is certain is that 2 lives were cut short, and Eddie Makdessi will spend the rest of his life behind bars. A man was convicted for a South Florida park crime, but then there was a twist in the case decades later. Regina Harrison was born on April 30th, 1963. She grew up in Dania, Florida. At just 20 years old, she was still living with her parents and pursuing her studies at Palm Beach Atlantic Junior College. Regina was a kind and thoughtful young woman. She carried her faith close to her heart, often keeping religious pamphlets in her bag. And she had a reputation for being both friendly and trusting. On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1983, Regina set out for a bicycle ride near her family's home. She pedaled toward the Hollywood Broadwalk, a popular stretch by the beach. That was the last time her family saw her alive. Witnesses later recalled seeing Regina riding alongside a skinny, long-haired man on a black bike, but they could not have known how important that detail would become. The next day, on May 3rd, the search for Regina ended in horror. Her body was discovered in Westlake Park in Hollywood, Florida. She had been indecently assaulted and strangled. Near the crime scene, the detectives found her bicycle, her neatly folded clothes, her backpack, and the religious pamphlets she often carried. The shocking crime devastated her family and rattled the community. The investigation quickly turned toward finding the man last seen with her. By the summer of 1983, a composite sketch was circulated, and witnesses pointed the police toward Ronald Henry Stewart, a man already known to law enforcement as a serial predator. By March 1984, the following year, a grand jury indicted Stewart for Regina's end. Stewart insisted he was innocent of the crime, but his criminal history worked against him. Facing the possibility of the end-of-life penalty, he accepted a plea deal. On January 28, 1985, he entered a no-contest plea to second-degree slaying in Regina's case and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The sentence ran concurrently with others he was already serving for multiple indecent assaults. For the justice system, the case was closed. For Regina's family, however, questions lingered. For more than 2 decades, Stewart lived behind bars, maintaining his innocence in Regina's case until he lost his life in 2008. Due to cancer, in prison. By then, new forensic methods like DNA profiling were transforming the way cold cases were solved, and Stewart's conviction began to look increasingly fragile. The truth came from an unexpected source. Jack Harold Jones, a convicted perpetrator and predator serving time in Arkansas, had built his own dark legacy of violence. In 1995, he indecently assaulted and took the life of Mary Phillips, a crime that earned him the end-of-life sentence. While awaiting execution, Jones began reflecting on his crimes. Before his end in 2017, he wrote a letter to his sister confessing to the crime of Regina Harrison back in 1983. He instructed her not to deliver the letter until a year after he passed away. When the letter was finally handed over to the Florida detectives in 2018, the investigators reopened Regina's case. They tested preserved evidence with modern DNA methods, and the results were undeniable. The DNA matched Jack Harold Jones, not Ronald Stewart. In 2019, more than 35 years after Regina's demise, the Broward County prosecutors officially exonerated Stewart. They acknowledged that he had been wrongfully convicted, based on flawed eyewitness identification and circumstantial evidence. His name was cleared posthumously, though he had not lived to see justice done. For Regina's family, the exoneration brought mixed emotions. On one hand, The truth about her real perpetrator had finally come out. On the other, decades had been lost to a wrongful conviction, and the man responsible for Regina's brutal slaying, Jack Harold Jones, had already been executed for another crime. An Edmonton, Alberta man is longing to see his sisters again after they went missing more than 3 decades ago. In the mid-1980s, Edmonton, Canada was home to 2 inseparable sisters, Anna Hakze, the elder, and Kym Hakze, nearly 20 years younger. They had a bond so strong that where one went, the other followed. But beneath the closeness ran family tension. Anna was already estranged from much of her family and struggling to make ends meet. For Kym, who admired her older sister deeply, the decision to leave home seemed less like a choice and more like destiny. Then, suddenly, they were gone. No word, no letters, no phone calls. Their family was left with silence, years stretching into decades. Their mother, uncertain what had happened, waited, hoping for a sign. It was not until 2003, almost 20 years later, that she officially reported them missing. By then, the trail was ice cold. The investigators began digging. They wondered if Anna and Kym were victims of foul play. Had they crossed paths with one of Canada's serial predators active at the time? Family members gave DNA samples that were compared against unidentified remains. Nothing matched. Tips trickled in, each one leading nowhere. The sisters seemed to have disappeared into thin air. To their brother and surviving relatives, the mystery was haunting. Every holiday, every birthday, the absence of Anna and Kym was an open wound. More than 30 years after their disappearance, the case landed back on a detective's desk in Lethbridge, Alberta. In 2017, during a review of old files, he came across something odd. A 1999 theft complaint filed in Vancouver by a woman using one of Anna's known aliases. When he tracked her down, the woman was not Anna, but she had kept something peculiar. Tucked away in her belongings was a 1984 newspaper clipping advertising a book, written under the same alias Anna had once used. She could not explain why she kept it, only that it had caught her attention. That scrap of paper was the thread the investigators needed. It connected with a tip from 2012 about a writer who might have been one of the missing sisters. Soon after, the police matched photos and pieced together leads pointing across the border. After more than 3 decades of silence, fingerprints confirmed the truth. Anna and Kym were alive, living in the United States under new names. When they were contacted, the sisters explained that they did not realize they were considered missing. They had simply walked away from their lives in Alberta all those years ago and built new ones, quietly and deliberately. Their request was simple: privacy. They had no desire for publicity, no wish to relive the past in front of cameras or strangers. For their brother, the news was both joyous and painful. He finally knew they were alive. But their mother, who had spent her final years wondering what became of her daughters, had passed away before the mystery was solved. The story of Anna and Kym remains unusual in the world of cold cases. It was a tale of reinvention and escape. 2 women severed ties with their old lives and managed to remain hidden for more than 30 years, only discovered thanks to a forgotten newspaper clipping and the persistence of the investigators. The case of a baby that was stolen in San Diego was finally solved. Dorothy Anzaldi and Jeff Anzaldi moved to Corning briefly. In 1987, and on March 20th, they became the parents of Kendra Joyce. Soon after, the couple returned to Oregon. 2 years later, Dorothy delivered baby Crystal Leanne during an emergency C-section at Tuolumne Community Hospital. Jeff joined the U.S. Navy, and the family moved to San Diego, where he served as a radio man. Having some financial problems, the family was temporarily living in the bottom of a 2-story house in San Diego's Golden Hill neighborhood. A friend of Dorothy told her about the house. The owner was supposed to be entering a rehabilitation center, and the Anzaldis could stay rent-free in exchange for taking care of her 3 children and doing some housekeeping. The truth was darker. The owner was heading to prison on an illegal substance charge. The neighbors recalled seeing strangers constantly coming and going from the house, which the police said was frequented by methamphetamine users. Dorothy said that the 3 children she cared for each had different fathers who came and went as they pleased through the apartment. Dorothy, Jeff, 3-year-old Kendra, and 14-month-old Crystal were sleeping together in the same bed on the morning of December 8, 1990, when the toddler disappeared. Jeff woke up about 7 a.m. and covered Crystal as she was sleeping. When he woke up again about an hour later, the chubby, sandy-haired baby was gone. As he searched for her, he noticed that the front door and a door leading to an upstairs apartment were ajar. Dorothy said she ran from room to room, screaming, yelling, "Crystal!" She ran around the block, went through the whole house, leaving no stone unturned. Neither did the police nor neighbors who joined in the search. They scoured the neighborhood, checking garbage bins, garages, inside homes. Helicopters swarmed over Golden Hill, blaring from loudspeakers, baby in diapers missing, nothing. The neighbors said that the day's chaos and terror still haunt them. Then, in 1997, at the age of 8, Crystal was recovered. It was not by chance. Her discovery came through a mix of suspicion, paperwork checks, and investigation into the false identity she had been living under. While living in Puerto Rico under the name Sonia Guzman, Crystal was enrolled in school and had an official-looking birth certificate, but that document had been forged by Nilza Girbellini Guzman. The authorities eventually uncovered irregularities in her paperwork. The falsified birth certificate did not fully match records in Puerto Rico's system. Once the forgery was flagged, the investigators dug deeper and realized that Sonia was actually Crystal Anzaldi, a child listed as missing from California since 1990. Crystal was taken into custody, and after confirming her true identity through investigative records, she was reunited with her biological father, Jeff, in Oregon. The motive behind her disappearance, or how she disappeared, remained a mystery. The only thing that was known is that Girbellini Guzman was in possession of Crystal in Puerto Rico and that she left San Diego with her on December 21, 1990. Guzman had lived in San Diego about 2 years when the child disappeared. The investigators said that she apparently knew people who frequented the Anzaldi's house, but did not know the couple. At the time, Guzman was married to Daryl Graham, who was in the Navy but assigned to a different ship than Jeff. Graham had been away at sea and in Saudi Arabia for some time before returning home in December 1990. In an interview, Graham said that when he returned, Guzman claimed to have given birth to the baby, but refused to say who the father was. Realizing it was not his, Graham booked his wife on a plane to her native Puerto Rico, and they divorced. Guzman was charged and convicted for falsifying Crystal's birth certificate. However, she is not convicted of kidnapping. Due to challenges in the legal case, the limited conviction leaves Crystal's family frustrated, feeling that full justice has not been served. In July 1973, a woman was brutally attacked. Despite the broad daylight assault and mounting evidence, the case went unsolved for nearly 3 decades. Concetta Penney Serra was born on March 2, 1952, in New Haven, Connecticut, to Italian-American parents, John and Pauline Serra. Her childhood took a difficult turn when her mother passed away in 1963, leaving her to take on responsibilities beyond her years. At just 11 years old, Penney stepped into the role of homemaker, caring for her younger sister Rosemary and supporting her father in keeping the household together. Her sense of responsibility extended beyond the home. Penney also helped her father with the daily operations of his auto repair shop, including bookkeeping and other business tasks. During her teenage years, Penney attended Wilbur Cross High School. Her plans for the future were modest but hopeful, as her 1971 yearbook entry listed her next step simply as college. Although college was her goal, Penney chose to delay that path to support herself financially. By 1973, she had taken a job as a dental assistant at a practice on Chapel Street in New Haven. In her personal life, Penney became engaged to Philip DeLieto, who who worked at his family's luncheonette near her workplace. The engagement, however, was troubled. Their relationship was marked by disagreements and difficulties that ultimately led Penney to end it. Despite this, the bond between them did not fully break. They continued to remain close, spending time together even after the engagement had been called off. On July 16, 1973, 21-year-old Penney drove her father's 1971 blue Buick Electra to work. She parked in the Temple Street parking garage, a structure just a few blocks away from her workplace. It was a busy weekday, with people moving in and out of the garage, yet what was about to happen would leave the city shaken. Around noon, shortly after parking her car, Penney was suddenly approached by a man inside the garage. Without warning, he attacked her with a knife, stabbing at her multiple times in a violent struggle. In a desperate attempt to escape, she staggered toward her father's vehicle but collapsed beside it, her injuries proving fatal. A parking attendant and several motorists soon came across the horrifying scene. Penney was lying on the concrete floor in a pool of her own blood, her life already slipping away due to one stab in the heart. Emergency responders were quickly called to the garage, but despite their efforts, she was pronounced deceased before medical aid could reach her. The authorities wasted no time in launching an investigation. The police began collecting statements and searching for witnesses who might shed light on the broad daylight assault. Several eyewitnesses came forward, reporting that they had seen a man chasing Penney toward the stairwell. Others recalled observing a man fleeing the area, driving a Buick erratically through the garage shortly after the attack. Physical evidence soon emerged, pointing to the assailant's attempt to escape. Blood was discovered both on the exterior and interior of a 1972 Buick registered to Penney's father. The vehicle had been abandoned on the 8th floor of the garage, with a bloody trail leading up to the 9th floor. The discovery suggested the attacker had moved quickly through the levels in an effort to avoid capture. The investigators continued their search, uncovering more disturbing clues. A box of tissues smeared with bloody finger marks was found inside the car, lying in the footwell behind the driver's seat. On the 9th floor of the garage, the police discovered a hairpiece belonging to Penney, further connecting the struggle to the crime scene. The investigators examined several potential suspects over the years, but each lead eventually collapsed under closer scrutiny. Her former fiancé came under suspicion early on, but he was cleared after investigators determined his blood type did not match the samples taken from the crime scene. In 1984, another suspect, Anthony Glennon, was arrested after his wife made statements implicating him, and the authorities noticed a scar on his hand. For a time, it appeared the investigators might finally have their answer. However, Glennon was eventually ruled out when tests confirmed his blood type also failed to match the assailant's. The case, once again, stalled. Not long after, suspicion shifted to a man named Selman Topiku, whose accent and similar license plate drew police attention. Despite the circumstantial details, the evidence was not strong enough to secure a warrant, and he was never charged. Each of these false leads only deepened the frustration surrounding the case, leaving Penney's family without closure. In 1987, 14 years after the crime, the investigation received new energy when John, Penney's father, personally urged the state's attorney's office to take control of the case. This decision led to a detailed reenactment of the events inside the Temple Street parking garage, giving the investigators a clearer picture of how the attack had unfolded. Through this exercise, along with updated forensic analysis, they concluded the assault likely began on the 7th floor and that the attacker had injured his left hand during the struggle. A decade later, technological advancements finally provided the long-awaited breakthrough. In 1997, the investigators revisited a key piece of evidence, a tissue box found inside the abandoned Buick. A latent fingerprint lifted from the box was run through the state's automated fingerprint identification system, which had only recently become available. The print matched Edward R. Grant, a 59-year-old auto mechanic from Waterbury, Connecticut, who had been fingerprinted following a 1994 domestic violence arrest. On June 24, 1997, Grant was arrested. The fingerprint evidence, combined with the fact that Grant had type O blood, the same type found at the crime scene, strengthened the case against him. Further DNA testing of material recovered from Penney's clothing, which had been inconclusive in earlier years, later confirmed Grant's connection to the crime. The investigators also noted that he had no prior relationship or known contact with Penney, making the act all the more senseless and shocking. In 2002, nearly 3 decades after Penney's life was ended, Edward Grant finally faced trial. The courtroom proceedings drew considerable attention, as the case had remained one of New Haven's most haunting unsolved crimes for years. The trial centered on the crucial forensic breakthroughs that had connected Grant to the crime scene. The prosecution presented the fingerprint recovered from the tissue box inside the Buick, which had been conclusively matched to Grant through AFIS. They also highlighted the DNA analysis from Penney's clothing, which further reinforced the case against him. Together, these pieces of evidence created what the prosecutors described as an overwhelming link between Grant and the slain. Grant's defense, however, sought to undermine the credibility of the investigation. They questioned the handling of evidence over the decades and suggested that police errors or even tampering could have influenced the results. Despite these claims, the defense did not directly dispute the scientific validity of the fingerprint or DNA analysis, acknowledging the strength of the forensic findings. On September 27, 2002, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Grant was sentenced to a prison term of 20 years to life. Grant, then 59 years old, swayed as if he had been hit when he heard the word guilty. But a few feet behind him in the courtroom, Rosemary, Penney's sister, wept as she absorbed the news. During the sentencing hearing, Penney's cousin, Joseph Serra, spoke on behalf of the family. His words captured the deep pain that had weighed on them since her end. He told the court that Grant had stolen Penney from John, his first daughter, emphasizing the personal devastation the crime had caused. For the family, the trial's outcome offered closure, though it could never undo their loss. The police authorities also addressed the conclusion of the case. They expressed that, after decades of frustration and ends, justice had finally been delivered for Penney. It is assumed that Grant wanted to steal the car, as it was new and desirable at the time. Henry C. Lee, the nationally known forensic science investigator who along with many others helped to finally solve the case, recalled during an interview, "John Serra came to me a couple of times. He said, 'Dr. Lee, you are our last hope.'" Lee also recalled his final conversation with John in 1998 when he was terminally ill in the hospital. "He called me from the hospital and said, 'Please do not forget my daughter.' I told him, 'We are working very hard on the case. Nobody will forget Penney.'" In March 1984, a father walked into his daughter's home in Houston, Texas, and made a devastating discovery. Decades later, CODIS would bring a breakthrough. Yleen Faye Kennedy was born on January 22, 1951, to parents Charles Chambers Kennedy Jr. and Elrose Lillie Tesh Kennedy. Yleen would eventually establish herself as a creative and hard-working woman, pursuing several ventures that highlighted her artistic and entrepreneurial spirit. She ran a small business focused on antique and used clothing, finding value in vintage pieces and curating them for her customers. Alongside this, she operated a retail used clothing store, broadening her reach in the local community. Yleen's interests did not stop there. She also created custom jewelry and built a reputation as an interior decorator. Her specialty was in stained glass decor. Yleen was not an only child. She had 2 siblings, one of whom was her younger sister, Lillie Dale Kennedy. Lillie was born in 1961, 10 years after Yleen. But Lillie's own path unfolded differently from Yleen's. By the age of 23, she was unemployed. Earlier in her working life, she had taken a job as a key punch operator. The 2 sisters lived together in Houston, Texas. Their home was located in the Heights neighborhood, a residential area known for its older houses and distinct charm. They shared a blue and white house at 600 East 12th Street. On March 5, 1984, tragedy struck the Kennedy family. That day, Jack made a horrific discovery when he entered his daughter's home in the Heights neighborhood. He found his 2 adult daughters, 33-year-old Yleen and 23-year-old Lillie, lying deceased on the floor. The shocking scene left him no choice but to immediately alert the authorities. The police arrived at the residence quickly after receiving the call. When the officers entered the home, they confirmed what Jack had already discovered. Both sisters' lives were brutally taken in what was clearly a violent attack. At the scene, the investigators noted that each victim had suffered gunshot wounds, making it evident that firearms had been used. The younger of the two, Lillie, had been shot in the back of the head. The wound was fatal and caused her life to be ended quickly. In contrast, her sister Yleen had endured far greater suffering at the hands of the perpetrator. The autopsy later revealed that Yleen had not only been shot, but had also been stabbed and bludgeoned. In addition to this, she had been assaulted. As the investigators examined the crime scene, it became apparent that the home had been ransacked. Items were missing, and the police determined that property had been taken. This pointed to the possibility of robbery as part of the motive, though the extent of violence inflicted on Yleen suggested far more than a simple burglary gone wrong. During the course of the investigation, the detective spoke with neighbors in hopes of gathering more information. One neighbor reported seeing a man leaving the house on the day of the crime. The man was carrying a duffel bag, raising the neighbor's suspicions that a burglary might have been in progress. When confronted, the stranger explained that his wife had kicked him out of the home. Accepting the explanation, the neighbor allowed the man to leave. Despite the leads, the investigators struggled to make progress. They conducted an extensive investigation, pursuing every angle available at the time. Yet no suspects were identified and no arrests were made. As a result, the case would remain unsolved and growing cold and dormant for decades. Cold case investigators revisited the case in 2009, 25 years after the brutal crime had first gone cold. Using evidence preserved from Yleen's assault examination, they were able to extract a DNA profile. This profile was then submitted to CODIS. Despite the effort, no matches were identified, and the case once again slowed to a standstill. The investigation remained stagnant until late 2014, another 5 years later, when an unexpected lead surfaced. A man who was facing charges in an unrelated matter came forward with information connected to the Kennedy case. He identified an individual named Edmund Deegan as a potential suspect. This tip gave the investigators a new direction and renewed hope that justice might finally be within reach. The detectives soon discovered that Deegan was still living in the Houston area. With this knowledge, they moved to obtain forensic evidence directly from him. The DNA collected from Deegan was entered into CODIS, where it was matched against the evidence preserved from the Kennedy crime scene. The results confirmed what the investigators suspected. Deegan's DNA was a direct match to the evidence connected to the case. In January 2015, the authorities arrested him, and he was formally charged. His trial focused on ending the life of Yleen, and in 2017, the court reached a verdict. Deegan was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. An HPD sergeant later explained that Deegan had actually been questioned back in 1984, shortly after the crime took place, but at that time he was not considered a suspect. Although the conviction provided some measure of accountability, the outcome left the Kennedy family devastated once again. Due to Texas's mandatory release law, which allows inmates to earn early release based on good behavior credits, Deegan was freed from prison far earlier than expected. On December 1, 2021, after serving only 7 years of his 15-year sentence, Deegan walked free. The release was a painful blow to the sisters' loved ones. Their niece Elliot, along with other family members, expressed deep anguish that the man convicted of such a violent crime would serve so little time. The Kennedy sisters were laid to rest in Hallettsville, Texas. At their father's request, their tombstones were engraved with the word "slain," a permanent reminder of the violence that ended their lives and the injustice their family continued to endure. In October 1999, a 4-year-old girl went missing during a short train ride between two villages in Belarus, Europe. The case would be solved decades later, thanks to an online article about a missing person case. Yulia Moiseenko was born in 1995, the daughter of Viktor and Lyudmila Moiseenko, who raised her in Belarus. Yulia's life appeared to be that of an ordinary child, until tragedy struck at an age far too young. In October 1999, Victor took his daughter on a short train ride between villages in Belarus. It was meant to be a simple trip, nothing unusual or out of the ordinary. The father and daughter boarded the train, and during the ride, Victor had a drink and eventually drifted off to sleep. While he slept, time passed quietly inside the train, but when he finally awoke, everything was drastically different. He was startled to find himself covered in blood. Even more horrifying was the realization that his young daughter was no longer by his side. Panic set in immediately as Victor comprehended the situation. The shock of waking up in such a state, combined with his daughter's disappearance, left him with no time to waste. Without delay, he reported what had happened to the police. His first priority was to ensure that the authorities were alerted to his missing child. The police wasted no time in beginning their investigation. With Victor's report in hand, they launched efforts to locate Yulia and uncover what had happened on that train ride. From that point forward, the search for Yulia became the central focus, as the investigators tried to piece together the tragic mystery. At the start of the investigation, the police looked closely at Yulia's father. Given the circumstances, his clothes stained with blood and his lack of memory, the suspicion initially fell on him. However, forensic testing cleared him. A DNA test on the blood covering his clothing proved that it did not belong to Yulia, ruling out the theory that he had harmed his daughter. Despite being cleared, Victor could provide little help to the investigators. He admitted that he could not remember if he had been in a fight or how the blood ended up on his clothes. He also had no memory of the crucial moments in which his daughter disappeared. With so few answers, the investigators were left with more questions than before. Alarmed by the disturbing case, the police expanded their efforts beyond the local villages. A widespread search mission was launched across the country. Teams were deployed, leads were followed, and attention was focused on train stations and rural areas. Still, no sign of the missing 4-year-old could be found. The trail grew cold, and the mystery deepened. While official searches faltered, Yulia's mother, Lyudmila, refused to give up. She continued her search independently, handing out posters with her daughter's photo at train stations. Her efforts were tireless and persistent, but despite her determination, no valuable information surfaced. The lack of progress left the family in anguish. That same year, a possible breakthrough appeared hundreds of miles away. 2 policemen in neighboring Russia discovered an abandoned 4-year-old girl at a train station in the city of Ryazan, located almost 1,000 kilometers from Minsk. The girl was unable to provide a full account of her past, but recalled one important detail. She remembered that her mother's name was Luda and her father's name was Victor. Those few words were the only clues the Russian police had about her origins. Unable to trace her biological family with such limited information, the girl's case took a different path. She was placed with a Russian family, Irina Alpatova and her husband, who formally adopted her. From that point forward, she was raised as part of their household, while her biological parents remained untraceable. Irina was a pharmacist from Ryazan. When her younger son was born with serious health problems, she made a promise to adopt one child if he survived. He has, and the thankful mother had to fulfill her oath. 2 years later, the Moiseenko family moved from their old house that was located close to a train station. Lyudmila said, "I could no longer watch the trains. We moved to a place that had no train station anywhere near." In the years following Yulia's disappearance, her parents, Victor and Lyudmila, searched frantically for answers. In their late 50s, they continued to live under the weight of suspicion, as many believed they might have been involved in their daughter's disappearance. Local police, who had initially been unable to solve the case, also turned their focus back on the parents, suspecting foul play despite the lack of concrete evidence. For a long time, the Moiseenkos carried both grief and stigma. They not only lived without their child, but also endured the painful implication that they could have harmed her. Although they had maintained their innocence from the beginning, the lack of progress in the investigation left the case clouded by doubt. In 2017, nearly 2 decades after Yulia vanished, the case was officially reopened by the police. Modern investigative approaches were applied, and both Victor and Lyudmila agreed to undergo lie detector tests. Each of them passed, reinforcing what they had insisted all along, that they were not responsible for their daughter's disappearance. The breakthrough that would change everything came in 2019. By this time, Yulia was 24 years old and living in Russia. Her boyfriend, Ilya Kryukov, began to search online for information connected to her past. In doing so, he came across details about a missing child case that bore striking similarities to Yulia's own life story. Curiosity turned into action, and soon, the connection between Yulia and the Moiseenko family was tested scientifically. A DNA examination was conducted to determine whether the young woman was indeed the same child who had disappeared from Belarus in 1999. The results confirmed the truth. Yulia was Victor and Lyudmila's biological daughter. The long-awaited reunion took place at a police station in Margina Horka, a settlement in Belarus. It was there that Yulia and her biological parents saw each other again for the first time since her disappearance 2 decades earlier. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, a moment that words could barely capture. Yulia recalled, "We were all in tears. The overwhelming flood of emotions left them unable to speak. Instead, the family clung to each other, letting years of separation melt away in silence." For Yulia, it was the physical closeness that mattered most, the reassurance of finally being back in the arms of her parents. As they embraced, Victor and Lyudmila shared what they had carried in their hearts for years. They told Yulia that they had never stopped searching, never abandoned the hope that they would one day find her. Their unwavering belief had been their strength during the decades of uncertainty. Lyudmila, overcome with joy, could not let go of her daughter. She hugged Yulia as if she were still the small child who had vanished so many years ago. At one point, she even pulled Yulia onto her lap, a tender gesture that revealed both her grief and her longing to make up for the lost years. Despite the joy of the reunion, Yulia's life remained firmly rooted in Russia. She chose to continue living in Ryazan, the city where she had grown up. There, she shared a home with her boyfriend, Ilya Kryukov, and their daughter. Her adoptive life, though separate from her origins, remained deeply important to her. Still, the reconnection with her biological parents was not left behind. Yulia maintained regular contact with her family in Belarus, keeping the bond alive across borders. Although Yulia has no recollection of her disappearance, her adoptive parents told her that she used to remember a ride on a train with an unknown man and an unknown woman, sleepovers in abandoned buildings, beggary and hiding from the police. Yulia's unknown companion left the girl on a train station in Ryazan. Her memories transformed him into a father figure, and therefore she was convinced her parents abandoned her. Yulia's life had a major turn, however. Every morning she receives text messages from Belarus. "Good morning to our daughter and granddaughter.